A young woman followed her ordinary route one winter evening, stepping out of a familiar bus and walking toward home as she texted her sister, with nothing unusual or alarming in sight. Yet somewhere in that short stretch, she vanished. Hours later, her belongings were found neatly arranged on a nearby bridge, but she was nowhere to be found. Searches of the river turned up nothing, cameras offered no clues, and every lead dissolved into uncertainty. With no witnesses, no evidence, and no trace of her ever recovered, only questions are left behind. Welcome to Without a Trace. I'm your host, Jalyn. Every file holds a mystery. Every story deserves to be heard. This is Tonee's story. Tonee Turner was born on June 10, 1987. She was the youngest of three sisters and grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. From a very young age, it became obvious to her family that Tonee was exceptionally talented. She was an artist in every sense. She painted, made jewelry, crafted ceramic pieces, danced, and could sketch anything. Tonee carried her sketchbook with her everywhere. She would draw anything and everything. Anything Tonee could do to express herself through art, she did. Her sisters and mother always supported and encouraged her art. Tonee attended Woodland Hills High School in the Turtle Creek area of Pittsburgh. Her friends in school remember a kind girl who was friends with everyone. After high school, Tonee continued to explore her artistic side. She worked with the organization Children's Windows to Africa. This organization exposes youth to various arts and forms of communication such as movement, music, dance, reading, song, storytelling, story writing, and hands-on science. It was here that Tonee taught ceramics to the children. She was passionate, not just about her art, but about community service and working with others. As a young adult, Tonee moved in with her boyfriend and a friend in the Hazelwood area of Pittsburgh, just a bit north of the Turtle Creek area where she grew up. She got a job working at Studebaker Metals, making jewelry. Every day, Tonee had a routine, and she followed it religiously. December 30th, 2019 was no different. Tonee woke up and took the bus from Hazelwood to Squirrel Hill, and then took another bus to Studebaker Metals. The entire trip was about a 7-mile journey, and Tonee made this trip without fail. She was at her job by 8 a.m. Later that day, around 4 p.m., Tonee left work, catching the same bus as she always did to return home. She exited the bus in Squirrel Hill and headed to a local cafe where she bought herself her regular drink. She spoke briefly with the workers and then left, hopping on the bus that would take her home to Hazelwood. Tonee got off the bus at her usual stop and started walking towards her home as the bus driver, who knew Tonee, waved. By now, it was about 6:15 p.m. On her walk home, Tonee was texting her older sister, Sydney, in what Sydney described as a completely normal conversation for the two of them. Tonee knew she'd be returning to an empty place since her boyfriend and roommate were both out of town. Tonee and her boyfriend had decided to separate, and Tonee was going to be moving out and moving in with her sister on January 1st in just a couple of days. Later that night, a cyclist crossing the Homestead Grace Bridge, a few miles away from Tonee's home, noticed something odd. Placed on the bridge was a bag, a pair of shoes, and a ceramic vase. He stopped and checked out the bag, finding a journal, a phone, and a set of keys inside. He took the bag with him, thinking these items sounded important and he would try to get them back to their owner. Because he was on bike, he left the shoes and vase. The next day, on December 31st, the cyclist used the phone to try to get in touch with someone who could get the items back to their rightful owner. He called a woman who identified herself as Tonee's aunt. Her aunt drove right over to pick up the bag. Her first thought was that Tonee had just lost her bag. The cyclist told her that he had left behind a pair of shoes in the vase that were left with the bag as he couldn't carry them on his bike. Tonee's aunt then got in touch with Tonee's sister, Sydney. Together, they went to the bridge to look for the shoes and vase, but found nothing. Sydney knew that Tonee was scheduled to work at Studebaker, so she called them looking for her sister. As soon as they told her that Tonee had not shown up for work that day, her heart sank. This was beginning to feel like something was wrong, instead of just a lost bag. There was no sign of Tonee at her home or all of her usual places either. On January 1st, 2020, Tonee was reported missing. While authorities put out an alert asking for tips on Tonee's whereabouts, her family had boots on the ground searching for clues. The thing about Tonee is that she didn't just have blood relative family members, she had friends and community members who loved her, and they quickly joined in on the search as well. Flyers were hung up everywhere, and word was spreading through the Hazelwood, Squirrel Hill, and Braddock areas. Authorities interviewed Tonee's ex-boyfriend and the other roommate, and both were confirmed to be out of town when Tonee disappeared. From what the authorities and Tonee's family have gathered, this is the timeline of events leading up to Tonee's disappearance. On December 30th, 2019, at 8 a.m., Tonee arrived at work as usual. She spent the day at work and no one noticed anything out of the ordinary. She left work at 4 p.m. at the end of her shift. She boarded a bus, the same one as she always did, and got off in Squirrel Hill. She did this regularly as she had to switch buses. She went into a local cafe and the workers there recognized her. Tonee ordered her drink, then left to catch the next bus that would take her near her home in Hazelwood. The bus driver knew Tonee, and while they said she was quiet that day, Tonee was often quiet. Just after 6 p.m., Tonee had exited the bus and was walking towards her home while texting her sister, Sydney. Sydney says that the conversation was completely normal and there was nothing out of the usual about it at all. No one knows what happened to Tonee from there. It was between 7:30 and 8 p.m. that the cyclist found Tonee's items on the bridge. Tonee's family didn't become aware of the items until the next morning, and that's when they went searching for her, checking her apartment and even calling her work. Unfortunately, many of the security cameras in that part of town weren't working on the day Tonee went missing. It is unknown how thoroughly her cell phone records were examined, but to date, nothing has been released to indicate any kind of clues as to what happened that day. Since Tonee's belongings were found on the bridge, authorities began to wonder if Tonee fell into the bridge or if she jumped. Tonee had been under some stress lately. She was working extra hours at work and was in the midst of a breakup, but she hadn't voiced any struggles to anyone. She was also excited to move in with her sister in just a few days. Divers searched the river while friends and family hiked nearby, up and down the river, looking for any signs of Tonee. None were found. The theory that Tonee fell or jumped off the bridge was quickly disproved. First, searches in and around the water turned up no sign of Tonee. Second, the bridge has high traffic. Given the timeline that authorities know, it seemed unlikely that Tonee could have been on the bridge during rush hour without anyone seeing something. Third, this bridge was a few miles from Tonee's home. If jumping was her goal, it made more sense for her to use one of the ones that was less trafficked and closer to her home. As the search continued, something strange happened. Underneath one of Tonee's missing person flyers, one of the searchers found Tonee's wallet. When Tonee first went missing, her wallet was missing, but someone returned it, placing it right under one of her flyers. This was an odd development in the case, but it didn't bring any answers to Tonee's whereabouts, and investigators were never able to learn who had Tonee's wallet and why they returned it. The entire community continued searching and pushed for answers. There were tips called in and sightings of Tonee reported around the greater Pittsburgh area, but none of which were confirmed to actually be Tonee. Tonee's case has gone cold, and investigators are no closer to solving her disappearance. Throughout the years, many have developed their own theories as to what happened to Tonee. Many still believe the investigators' first theory that Tonee jumped off the bridge. There are many factors that make this theory possible, but there are also some factors that leave unanswered questions. Tonee's belongings were found neatly placed on the bridge over a large flowing river that on average is 15 to 20 feet deep. She was going through some major life changes, including a breakup with a boyfriend and moving in just a few days. She also was said to have been struggling with her job as she was working a lot of hours and was not happy there anymore. Some believe these reasons justify self-harm, but others don't feel this was enough. Tonee hadn't left behind a suicide note, and she hadn't said anything to anyone that hinted that this was on her mind. Plus, authorities had investigated Tonee's diary, and there was no hint that she was considering doing anything like this. Then there's the fact that Tonee's body was never found, despite extensive searches in and around the water. So, while this theory is possible, it's not the most plausible. The second main theory is foul play. Hazelwood's crime rates are higher than the national average overall, especially for violent crimes. It is possible that Tonee was met with foul play on the bridge itself, or perhaps her items were placed there to mislead everyone into believing that she jumped. Though there's no evidence to suggest foul play, and authorities have not identified suspects or persons of interest. Those closest to Tonee, including her ex-boyfriend, had solid alibis. The third theory is that Tonee left town on her own. This theory doesn't seem likely, as all of Tonee's money and identification had been left behind, and there would have been no hits on her social security number anywhere. In the years since that winter night, Tonee's disappearance has remained a mystery. No trace of her has ever been found. No witnesses stepped forward, no camera captured her final steps, and no theory fully explains how she vanished in the span of an ordinary walk home. Thank you for listening to Without a Trace. I hope you enjoyed our deep dive into Tonee's disappearance. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe and follow Without a Trace on social media, and join me next week as I dive into another case.